Let's imagine that it's 2045 and we're a fly on the wall in the Oval Office. The virulently anti-American, Islamist-controlled Libyan government has been not so secretly pursuing nuclear weapons for many years. And U.S. intelligence has just discovered evidence that the Libyans may get their first nuclear weapon within about 6 months. After long promising that Libya would never achieve a nuclear capability, the president has gathered her top security advisors in the Oval Office to discuss a full-scale military intervention to destroy Libya's nuclear infrastructure and topple the government. After a few minutes of listening to the conversation, the president's national security advisor jumps to her feet and says, "If we invade Libya, it's going to be just like..." How does she finish that sentence? How do the others in the room respond to that sentence? Before you answer, let me tell you a little bit more about who's in the room. President Ellen Johnson, 62, born in 1983. National Security Advisor Natalie Burns, 60, born in 1985. Vice President Tom Conrad, 57. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Bill Rogers, 59. I'll spare you the math. These are all millennials, right? The president was 18 when 9/11 occurred. She was 20 when the United States invaded Iraq in 2003. All of the principals in the room were in what sociologists call the critical period, the time when young adults are at their most impressionable and most likely to form lifelong attitudes about the world. Of course, we can't really know what else is going to happen between now and 2045 to help the security advisor finish that sentence, but from what we know about how people form their views, we can be pretty darn sure that the events and the historical context at the turn of the millennium, when these folks were in their critical period, are going to have a lot to do with the end of that sentence. And more broadly, as the millennial generation grows and becomes a larger percentage of the adult population and takes over leadership positions, they're going to have a bigger influence on elections and certainly on U.S. foreign policy. So it's not too early, I don't think, to get a start on figuring out what these folks think and how that might affect how they act. Let's start with just a few basics so we're all on the same page about who these folks are. As Chris said, these are the folks born between roughly 1980 and 97. Different folks and organizations will put the years of start and stop differently. There's always arguing about that. For our purpose, it doesn't matter at all. Regardless of whose numbers you use, they're now the biggest generation, having just earlier this year overtaken the baby boomers as largest chunk of the population. They are also now the biggest chunk of the adult workforce, having just recently overcome Gen X in that regard. So they're big and they're beautiful and they're here to stay. The second thing, and this has gotten a lot of press, they're the most liberal generation. And this kind of continues a trend that from previous generations, each being a little bit more liberal than the preceding generation. There's also been a lot made of the fact that they've been less excited about Obama since the first election, and that's certainly true. But most of the research, as far as we can tell right now, suggests that they are likely to stay more liberal than all other generations throughout their lifetime. Part of this may be due to the fact that it's also the most diverse American generation. Just 57% of the millennial generation is white, sort of Euro-American, and 11% of them are the children of immigrants, compared to 7% of Gen Xers and 5% of baby boomers. So it's a diverse and liberal generation. No surprise to any of you, they're also, of course, the most technologically savvy and connected generation. Not only more likely to post a selfie on Facebook or whatnot, which I'll do later, but they're also the first generation in American history to actually use technology to identify what makes them different from preceding generations. They actually, if you ask them, what makes you guys different? They actually mention technology. The internet is kind of their thing. Amazing. And this leads to something that's very important for someone who studies the way people think and reason about foreign affairs, and that is that they're the least likely generation to get their news from, newspapers or television, mainstream news. They're the most likely generation to get their news from the internet. About 50% of them get their primary news from the web or their phone or what have you. And I'm pretty sure, just based on informal surveys of my students over the last few years, that many of them have never seen a hard copy of a newspaper at all, period. Not to offend anyone here, but millennials are, on paper, the least patriotic generation of Americans. Now, 70% of them will describe themselves as a very patriotic person. This is about 20 percentage points less than every other generation. for starters. The second thing that's a little more interesting and curious is that only 32% of them agree with the statement that the United States is the greatest country on earth. You want to start a dinner squabble, just throw that one out there sometime when your grandparents are visiting. And so, right. And so that's also about 20 points less or more than other generations. So, millennials really see the United States in the world in a very different way from their elders. And then just a sort of a note of warning, we're going to focus so much on millennials and how they differ from other generations that it'll be easy to get the sense that millennials are a homogeneous group and they are all the same and then they differ from everyone else. And of course, that's just not true. There's actually more variation within the millennial generation than between the millennials and others, just as is true for all the other generations. But just keep that in mind. We'll probably come back to it. But just so you know, I'm not trying to paint all millennials as being sort of one mind. Okay, so now we know more or less who they are. We want to know what do they think about foreign policy and more and how and why that differs from previous generations. But before we can answer those questions, we need to ask the more general question, why should we expect a new generation to think differently? Why don't they just think the same? And in short, the answer, as Chris mentioned, is historical context. Each generation, thanks to sharing relatively close birthdays, experiences together a world that is very different from the one their parents grew up in, and experiences different events from their parents that potentially can have a very dramatic impact on the way they think about the world. Social scientists, of course, have a fancy word for this process. It's called political socialization. And the process by which each generation is socialized to understand the world. And in thinking about this concept in the early 50s, the sociologist Karl Mannheim came up with this critical period hypothesis. And he argued that young adulthood, when people are old enough to understand the world with more or less adult understanding, but still young enough to still be raw and unformed, this is the critical period during which lifetime beliefs and worldviews will be shaped by context, by events, and so on. Now, in a recent study of, just to give you a feel for how this works, a recent study of political socialization and presidential voting preferences by Yair Gitza and Andrew Gelman found that you can model people's sort of current beliefs or preferences by looking at sort of a sum total of all their previous exposure to information and the world. And so, in other words, if I want to vote for president today, every exposure to a popular Republican president in my past sort of tilts me Republican. Every exposure to a negative exposure to a Democratic president tilts me away from a Democrat, and so on. And so, your current vote is the result of all of those different influences. But what they found in their study, directly in line with Mannheim's critical period hypothesis, is that not all exposure to information is created equal. And as you can see from this chart here, events between the ages roughly of 14 to 24 are the most important in shaping your eventual preferences for voting. And in fact, their model shows that events that you experience at age 18 are 3 times as important to your views as things that happen to you when you're 40. And by the time you're 45, and if you see how the faint gray line dips below the dotted line, by the time you're 45, events have no statistical significance, no impact on you whatsoever, which is, the fancy way of saying you can't teach an old dog new tricks, right? So, I think this research probably just confirms what you in your gut already knew, which is young people are impressionable. When really big, scary, important things happen, it can scar them for life. But once you've been around the block a few times, it might be a big deal, but you kind of already know what you think. And so, that's the critical period hypothesis. And what it means for our work is that each new generation, and really the definition of a generation is people who go through their critical period at the same time, right? Each new generation shares uniquely shares a set of experiences that can be very powerful and that are different from the way their parents experience it. 9/11 for a young person is not the same as 9/11 for an old person. They're just in 2 different places, right? And that's the idea. So every generation represents an opportunity for change because of this critical period concept. So now that we have this model of critical period and intergenerational change, we can start to think about how and why millennials differ from others. But before we do that, I'm going to make a couple of caveats, both to prevent criticism later and also because this is just part of studying cohorts, as we usually call generations. the first big reason it's hard to study generations is because it's very hard to distinguish between three different kinds of effects going on: cohort effects, aging effects, and period effects. A cohort effect, as I've kind of been suggesting, is a situation in which a young generation is exposed to some context or event that shapes the way they think about the world for their lifetime. So that's a cohort effect. On the other hand, an aging effect is something that happens to everybody, no matter when they were born, as they get older. So for example, most people when they're young are not very interested in public affairs, but most people as they get older become more interested in public affairs. So this is true for someone born in 1920, it's true for someone born in 1990, it's true for someone today. Wherever you started, you're probably going to get more interested in public affairs. And then finally, a period effect is when some major event causes a temporary effect across all generations. So the Vietnam syndrome is kind of your classic example of a period effect. Everyone after Vietnam was more wary of US military intervention than they were before. The key to a period effect, though, is that as the event recedes into history, so does the effect. So the effect fades with time. Now, what makes it really tricky and really very interesting to study this stuff is that one or two generations period effect can be the youngest generation's cohort effect. So Vietnam again, it affected everyone for 5, 10 years, whatever it was. But the folks who were in their critical period between 14 and 24 during the worst part of Vietnam, those people have carried a permanent set of worldviews out of Vietnam that are much stronger than their elders. So it can be very tough to know right away the difference between a period effect and a cohort effect. And one of the things we'll probably caveat several times today is that it's sometimes just too early to know what you're seeing. Are you seeing a period effect, or are you seeing what's possibly going to end up lasting a lifetime? So we'll probably talk about those things in the discussion. I just want to sort of lay the groundwork for that now. So if the critical period hypothesis is right, if it's a good guide to understanding millennials, then the period we need to be thinking about is between 1994, when the oldest millennials turned 14 and came into the critical period, and 2021, when the youngest group of millennials will hit the end, will be 24 at the end of their critical period, roughly speaking. And so just a little bit more math, not to stress you out, but makes it obvious we're not quite done with the millennials' critical period, so we can't make totally comprehensive statements about, what their critical period did to them. Lord only knows what's going to happen next. So, but it is also true that most millennials at this point have passed through their critical periods. Right? Only the youngest are still sort of going through them. So we argue that a close look at what's happened between 1994 and today is going to provide really important clues to understanding how millennials think about foreign policy. And so as Chris mentioned, there are really two things that we talk about in the paper that we think help us understand where millennials are in their thinking. And the first category are these trends and events that started or occurred before millennials came of age and are really the historical context. The end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the evolution of the global distribution of power, the rise of China, the development of the internet, the raging acceleration of globalization, things like that. These changes, which millennials didn't see, right, produced a new normal for millennials. They just like breathing air. They don't know any different, and it's really radically different from their parents when they grew up. So there are real opportunities to see change there, I think.